The index is a tool, a research tool we developed to try and rank or measure the strength of multiculturalism policies across Western democracies. We developed this tool because we found that the debate about multiculturalism was growing more intense, and people were using the word in different ways and were making very bold claims about what was happening without a lot of evidence. And so we developed this tool, this ranking system, to try and develop a more precise measure of the extent to which different countries have adopted multiculturalism policies. We developed we chose 8 indicators or 8 types of policies which we thought were at the core of the debate. And we then spent numerous hours, or our research assistants spent numerous hours going through the documentary evidence on 21 countries and getting the evidence on what the extent to which they had adopted those policies, and we produced an overall ranking of the strength of multiculturalism policies, demonstrating that some countries had gone down the road towards multiculturalism policies over the years, and some countries had chosen not to. But I think for the first time we had a more serious, concrete measure of the strength and the differences between countries. Well, I think there are several important differences. You would have to start with the nature of the immigration flows in the 2 cases. In the Canadian case, we have, had a much longer history of immigration. This is a historic country of immigration. It's been built, in effect, by immigrants. And so there's a historical comfort level with the level of immigration. There's also the fact that our policies have tended to select for higher levels of education and training in immigrants. And therefore, they have had a better record than certainly in Europe of moving into the labor force and becoming self-sustaining and productive members of society, people who contribute to the country effectively. We've had some difficulties more recently in that regard, and immigration policies being adjusted. But certainly compared to Europe, we have had a more successful process of integrating newcomers into the economic and social mainstream. And then I think the final big difference about Canada compared to some other countries is that we have developed, I think, a more open conception of our basic identity, who we are as a people, partly because of the historic nature of the country, the fact that we have never had one single culture. We've always been a kind of combination of different peoples, Quebec, First Nations, people whose heritage was originally from the UK. From the very beginning, the country had multiple peoples here and multiple cultures. And as a consequence, it was easier, perhaps, for us to have an identity that was more inclusive, not to have a tightly defined sense of who we are. And so immigrants, when they came, didn't have to leap over as many cultural hurdles, I think. So these 3 things in combination have made us more comfortable with immigration than some countries have been. Well, it's a complicated story in Europe because, and our Multiculturalism Policy Index is actually very helpful here. If you look at the nature of public debate, political debates, academic debates, if you look at discourse, the way people talk about multiculturalism in Europe, it's clear there's been a pervasive retreat or backlash against multiculturalism. If you actually look at policies in these countries, if you look at the actual programs that have been put in place, to recognize, support, legitimate cultural differences, there's been relatively little change. The Netherlands actually turns out to be quite an exception to the overall trend in Europe. It's one of the very few countries which has actually taken out, uprooted multiculturalism policies that have been put in place by an earlier generation. Most of Europe has either maintained the policies they put in place or in some cases expanded. So on average, multiculturalism policies got stronger over the last decade, a decade in which public debate actually attacked multiculturalism. So there's a kind of odd disjunction between the debate on one hand and the policies on the other. Not necessarily. I would argue that the Canadian policy package actually combines multiculturalism and what the Europeans now call civic integration. We have policies in place which support cultural diversity, which celebrate the diversity of Canada. Indeed, it's one of the central features of how we define ourselves. We are diverse, and we think that's an appropriate kind of society to live in. But we also expect and support what the Europeans call civic integration, which is a process of making sure that newcomers move into the mainstream of society, that they move into the economy, that they increasingly embrace the liberal democratic process of government and the conceptions of equality between men and women and so on. An emphasis in our naturalization policies on the fact we expect newcomers to learn about not just our languages, but our history, our culture, our geography, our political institutions. And so in the Canadian context, we've put together multiculturalism and civic integration into a single package. So I think they can be made to work together, but they will only work together well if the approach to civic integration is gentle, is liberal, facilitates movement of newcomers, but is not punitive in the treatment of newcomers when they arrive.